All right. So welcome everyone who is joining us today from the GFF conference, either that or if you're taking one of our seminars, either mine or Ashami's or Ina's in Augsburg. And we're very happy to be speaking to Cheryl Morgan and Maria Turtschaninoff today. And so, yeah, I would just give the two of you a few minutes to introduce yourself to us, I think, because that's always easier what people actually want to highlight about their careers. Cheryl is obviously a publisher and an author, both in fiction and academic works, and Maria is an author of young adult fantasy fiction. So whoever wants to go first, Cheryl, perhaps.
Oh, right. Hello, yes, I'm Cheryl. I do a whole bunch of things. I'm primarily known in science fiction circles for being a critic. I, a long time ago, won a Hugo for having a book review magazine on the internet, which in 2004 was absolutely revolutionary. That things have changed a lot since then. I was on the staff of Clark's World magazine for a while as a non-fiction editor. I own and run Wizard's Tower Press, which is a small press based in the UK. And I occasionally write fiction, but not very well. Maria.
I am, like Serena said, I'm a fantasy author. And so far my fantasy has been classified as YA. I live in Finland and I belong to the Swedish-speaking minority in Finland. And I've been active as a writer for, 13 years now. And I've published, I think, 7 novels.
Right, that's impressive. And your work has been translated into English and German, which I think some the languages that most people speak in our audience today. And I think in Germany it's Heine Verlag in Pushkin Press, if that's correct. So yeah, if you get interested and you haven't read Maria's books yet, you will be able to find them fairly easily. So yeah, one of the first things I think we wanted to talk about, and that pertain to both of you, I guess, is how do you see yourself as a woman in this industry? First of all, in kind of what is still considered male genres. Somebody's microphone is on.
Oh, sorry.
Cheryl, do you wanna start?
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be asked that question, because at the moment my Twitter feed is all lit up with people complaining about sexual harassment at conventions and the like again. You would have thought we would have got to the bottom of this by now, but every few months some new case comes up, and you know, there's a whole big fuss. I tend to miss most of this because I'm old, and you know, I also have very high profile relationships, so people don't tend to chase after me. But you know, the number of stories out there from women writers about things that they've experienced is just utterly ridiculous. But that, of course, is not by any means unique to our field. We find that everywhere, and you know, we'll maybe discuss some of this later. But I think in terms of diversity, we do relatively well in science fiction and fantasy. It's just that the world is pretty shit at times, and we're no exception. Maria?
Yeah. I don't know, if sometimes I feel like where I live and work, that I get to be pretty sheltered. Also writing YA, and my first novel was a middle grade fantasy novel. And at least in Swedish in Finland, the only people really who write for children are women. So it's nothing that specifically as a woman writer, I haven't had to feel disadvantaged really by being a woman. It's more that whole thing of being that weird fantasy writer, or then writing for children or for a young audience. That's where the struggle comes in for me, much more than the whole gender thing.
Yeah, and I should note that Finland is a wonderful place, and my experience of conventions there is that they are far more friendly and safe for women than pretty much any other country I've ever been to.
I've only really experienced conventions, for instance, in Finland and Sweden, and have had no problems.
It's good to hear. It's speaking of, like, in Germany, I mean, I've been mostly to science fiction conventions that are more focused on film and television rather than novels, really, but there's still very male dominated. I feel like the last 5 years or so, it's kind of broken up, and it's a much more open space also for queer people specifically. But like something like FedCon in Germany, which is a big science fiction con, for the longest time was dominated by kind of the cliche male nerd in many ways. So that's kind of never been a very inclusive space. But yeah, also I think speaking to that, so not just being a woman in the space, but also writing for and writing about women, or also writing for and writing about minorities like queer people. Maybe you want to touch upon that as well, especially again in fantasy. Or why do you think that does that matter, or does it matter?
Well, I do get the question, why have I chosen to write about strong girls and women? Which is, of course, not a question I would get if I had mostly male protagonists. And it's still a few years ago, my books were shelved in the library system in Finland under one of the categories was strong girls, which is very frustrating because, of course, there was no equivalent. There was no strong boys category. And after I pointed that out, they actually changed it. But so there is that aspect. And I do encounter a lot of, why do you write about girls? And why are men in your books evil? Which is incredibly simplistic, because they aren't. But as soon as there are mostly women, I guess, as in a few of my books anyway, mostly female protagonists, and then some of the men happen to be the villains, that is very provocative to some people and some readers.
Yeah, I think in your books men behave like men do, and some of them are rather nice and some of them are utterly awful, and apparently that means you're making all men evil.
Yes, but it's very
not all men.
Not all men, and it's interesting because, for instance, I have one book which is an urban fantasy which has not been translated into any other language except Finnish. I write in Swedish, and I have two protagonists in that book, a boy and a girl, and people sort of miss that the boy is also a protagonist, and kind of group that book and with the rest of my work, saying you only write about girls. And also my debut novel had a boy and a girl as the main characters, but somehow, because the girl is there, I don't know why she negates the boy characters. And I hopefully, I mean, my aim is to write all kinds of characters that are full and round and complete, whether they are coded male or coded female or something else.
So again, also maybe also specifically for Cheryl now, because if you look at Cheryl's CV, again, you publish, but you also write yourself, but you also don't just do that like as a trans woman and for queer people as well. But you also write on history quite a bit. So you also do highlight trans history in all of this. And there's always the question of like, would you consider what you do activism of some sort, or is it just, you know, like what you do? But I mean, knowing from my own experience working in archiving, all of these things, working on queer history, it necessarily quite often does become an activist practice of some sort just because of the world we still live in. So I was wondering how much of your work is actually considered activism, I guess.
At the moment, all of it. Simply being a trans person in the UK means that you are an evil, violent activist. So, so there's that side to it. And yeah, I mean, just existing in the world makes me and what I do an activist.
So when you maybe also again to that, so your publishing house is called Wizards Tower Press. Maybe you want to use the moment to talk a bit about what you actually publish at Wizards Tower Press, because I think when you go to the website, which I've done a few times in the past, it always says, well, you know, you don't actually commission new works, as far as I understand. Most of the time you actually try to republish works that otherwise might have been overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason I stick on the website that we don't commission stuff is to prevent being deluged with people saying, please publish my novel, because, you know, it's a part-time operation for me. I don't have the time or indeed additional staff to do all of that sort of thing. So, you know, at the most we'll publish maybe 4 or 5 books a year. Last year it was only 2. So there's that side to it. But the reason that Wizards Tower was originally set up was because 10 years ago, almost exactly, the publishing world was a very different place. We were just moving from the era where you could come in, you could establish yourself as a mid-list writer and you could have a career, to the point where you came in and if you didn't hit the bestseller charts after 2 books, the publishers would drop you and nobody would care anymore. And also at that time, ebooks were a relatively new thing. Most people didn't know how to make them. The tools to make them weren't there. So when I started Wizards Tower, the objective was to help my friends who were mid-list writers, who were being dropped by their publishers, whose books were going out of print, and to get them back into print, at least by means of ebooks. I wasn't really planning on doing paper originally, but as often happens, things have grown since then. I've done a bunch of anthologies, mostly with local writers from the southwest of England, and that's more of a project of helping young writers get a foot in the market, people who are not yet confident enough to go for markets where they're professional rates, but at least they can get in a book and they can get a professional editor to look over their work. And I've also got 1 book in translation on the list, and I'm going to be adding 2 more to that this year, because translations are something that's very important to me. I'm trying to help broaden people's outlook a little bit by looking at countries where English is not the dominant language.
That's great. Yeah, since you brought up the publishing industry, I mean, obviously some changes I think are more global in terms of, obviously now a lot of people have moved towards ebooks. It's much more important to sell right out of the gate. Maybe Maria wants to also just like speak to your experience about what it was like when you started out. Did you also have to have a hit right out of the gate, or how has that been going?
Well, our book market is so very, very different, because I write in Swedish, a minority language in a country which is small to begin with. So my potential market is tiny, which means that you can't, even if you sell very well, you still sell very little, which gives a certain kind of strange freedom, because there's very little pressure, because whether you sell, you know, the normal amount or incredibly well can be a difference of a few hundred copies. So I get very little pressure from my publisher. to have hits in that sense. But I'm very lucky and I'm very happy that I've also got to or had the privilege of being published in other countries like the UK and the US. And I've gotten sort of a glimpse of what the publishing industry can look like in other places. And I think that makes me appreciate what I have more. The possibility to make money is non-existent really in Finland, but the artistic freedom is much greater than I see many of my colleagues having in other countries. So I have a freedom to sort of just build my career and think long term, take my time. I had a conversation with my editor. I've had the same editor for all my books. And I had a conversation with her a few weeks ago where she was like, but take your time, it's fine. You don't have to publish at a certain pace. The literature will benefit from time and giving it the time it needs. And I was like, no, must produce, must be faster. Because of course I would also, I'm trying to make a living. So there's that constant struggle.
So do you think being in the young adult market still, is that beneficial to maybe like having that kind of niche, or do we actually think that doesn't really make sense, that it's still kind of stuck in that category? Or do you consider yourself a young adult writer really, or is that something that kind of was a label that was attached to you and you keep writing in that segment now? Or because I know there's a stigma in some to being the young adult writer, and it's
absolutely. I consider myself to be a fantasy writer, and for me, fantasy really, in a sense, for me, it would be completely unnecessary to segment fantasy like YA and so forth, because for me, good fantasy works across any age group, really, and that's how I've always read fantasy from a very young age. That said, I don't mind being labeled a YA writer or someone who writes for children and young adults, as it's often phrased here. Specifically, I think because I am from a minority, and I see how important it is that we have literature written in our own language as a minority. And I see how important it is for the kids in schools that I visit, that there are books written sort of in a sense for them and that they can relate to, even though I write mostly in a secondary fantasy universe, which of course then helps when my books have traveled abroad, definitely. But still that they kind of see that you can write fantasy in Swedish, because whenever I do workshops, for instance, for young writers, they all, not all, but let's say 70% of them want to write in English, because that's what they read. And for them, fantasy, as the fantasy language is English. And I'm very happy to be able to show them that no, you can also do it in your own language. So I'm okay-ish with being labeled as a YA writer, but mostly I see myself as a fantasy writer.
Okay. So, or Cheryl, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as far as the English-speaking market is concerned, I'm afraid you're stuck being a YA writer now, partly because you started with it, and secondly because you're female. I mean, I've just been doing a lot of work with Mike Carey, and his new book, the lead character is definitely a teenage boy, and there's another lead main character that will come in more in the second book, who is definitely a teenage girl. And yet Mike's books will be labeled for adults because he's a man. If a woman had written the same book, it would be labeled YA. And that's just the way our publishing industry works, I'm afraid.
Really interesting. I mean, I've heard stories definitely of children's book authors or others that were told to just use the initials of their names rather than write out their full names, so nobody would see that they're actually women. So yeah, I mean, it's not surprising, sadly, that there's so much sexism happening, but at the same time, it's always disheartening whenever you hear it. But since Maria just said, well, you consider yourself a fantasy author, so why was it fantasy that you wanted to write? And also in Cheryl's case, why fantasy and science fiction that you wanted to write and publish? Why not, whatever else, really?
For me, fantasy has always been my home. This is where I live. This is what I, eat and breathe. For me, I did try when I was younger, when I wanted to just sort of, my dream was to be a writer. I tried to write what I thought was proper literature because I so desperately wanted to be a proper writer. So I tried to write all kinds of stuff that I did not enjoy reading, of course, with catastrophic results. And it wasn't until I managed to allow myself to write what I wanted to read that I sort of realized, if I really let go, whatever I write ends up being in the fantastic realm in one way or the other. And as soon as I allowed myself to go there, writing became much more fun and much more pleasurable and much more me. So that was originally how it happened, but I think the reason I've stayed in the fantasy genre is because for me as a writer, it gives me so many more tools to work with than if I was writing merely realistic fiction. I really feel that it gives me the most powerful toolkit to explore our world, what it means to be human, from different perspectives, and making it speak to people across the world in any culture of any gender, hopefully any and all genders, because I can sort of remove so many of the things that make us go into a text with preconceived notions about our own world. So that's definitely one of the reasons I've stayed. And I think that's one of the reasons that I also love reading fantasy, because it has that global appeal, if you know what I mean, that fantasy readers understand each other around the world. And my books have now been translated or published in, I think it's 25 countries. So I think that also sort of speaks to that.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl?
Yeah, well, like Maria, I grew up on it. As a kid, I would read comics. We had Dan Dare and stuff like that. Marvel comics were imported to the UK when I was relatively young, so I grew up reading the Avengers and the X-Men and Doctor Strange and all that sort of thing. I'm old enough to have watched the first ever episode of Doctor Who on the telly. And of course, we also had Jerry Anderson with Fireball XL5 and Stingray and Thunderbirds, all that stuff. So I grew up on science fiction and fantasy. It's always been part of my life. But having said that, I agree entirely with Maria that it is a far better medium to be working in than mere realist fiction, because there's so much that you can do. And just as an example of that, back in the 1970s, when I was a teenager, there were science fiction writers putting trans people in their novels and doing a pretty good job of it. In fact, a far better job than most cisgender people writing mainstream fiction with trans characters do today. So yeah, that toolkit is amazing, and it allows you to examine all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. So directly to that, I guess, speaking towards transgender representation or transgender rights, so do you think it's easier perhaps also to use then that fictional space, and especially like the speculative fiction, the science fiction, to talk perhaps also about a future where things look much differently than it is today, to kind of imagine as a trans person what a better world might look like? I mean, we all do that obviously through that medium, but do you think
certainly science fiction invites you to imagine what a better world might look like. But equally, I think we're sort of freed from the expectation to conform. That if you are writing realist fiction, particularly if you're doing it in the market for young people, then everybody is looking at what you're doing and saying, is that a good portrayal of the world, and is it educational for the children? That sort of. As soon as you write fantasy, people, oh yeah, it's just fantasy, it doesn't matter. And I think with the adult stuff, that, you know, there's just this pressure on realist writers to put out stuff that is what society expects. And because society has for decades now expected incredibly negative portrayals of trans people, that's what realist writers will put out.
Maria, is there anything you'd want to add to that? Maybe not specific trans issues, obviously, but generally like the space that we can envision, I guess, different worlds through fantasy.
Yeah, I don't write science fiction myself, so I don't, in that sense, have that envisioning another world. I feel more that I reflect our world, and I want to do it as truthfully and as completely as I can, depending on what, of course, I want to write about, what topic, what themes. But for me, that means, to the best of my ability, to include everyone who's here, simply. To me, it would be very unrealistic to leave out queer people and people of all, you know, walks of life in general. So that's really only what I'm trying to do is I want to be truthful to what humans are.
Yeah, we have a question from Ashumi, actually, and I'm going to read it because she said her voice sounds like Gollum at the moment.
I want to talk to Gollum. That sounds fun.
Can we all do Gollum impressions now?
I mean, I don't want to take away from Ashumi if she'd actually rather turn on her camera herself, but and she has a rather complicated question that's obviously from a literature scholar, which I'm not, but I'm going to read this out. How crucial is the real or nomadic aspect in creating discomfort or estrangement with the reader to be able to speculate regarding the better world?
Wait, what?
I don't think that writers spend any time at all thinking about literary theories of science fiction when they're writing their novels.
That's the thing. I don't know if you want to, Ashumi, if you want to clarify.
I'm going to try to simplify this, the question a little. Basically, one of the things that my students, I teach science fiction and fantasy right now, and one of the things that my students like to do is compare the fictional aspects and the real or neomatic aspects of what we read. So for example, if we were reading Harry Potter, they would hold on to the idea of a school with, you know, the 4 houses and everything. That's the anchor to what we really see. We see a school every day and school students, and, you know, they interact with each other. But then there's the school is kind of necessary to understand the fictional aspects of the story, which is, you know, there's this magic and there's hierarchy within the magical world and so on. So my question was that, since in fiction and science fiction and fantasy fiction, we try to imagine a higher form of society or a more civilized civilization, so to speak. In such a situation, when you as a writer are creating this, how important is it for you to be able to anchor it in the reality around us? That's what I meant.
I don't know if I'm trying to create a higher form of our society, but I interpret or choose to interpret your question now as a world building question, because that is what I know and what I love doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for me, that is an essential part of my world building, because I feel like the more real I can make the world for the reader, the more I can then, you know, fly. The more I can make you believe in all the fantastical elements. So I make a really big effort of anchoring my text, my stories, my worlds in in detail, in the mundane, in food, in chores, in simple tasks, so that I can sort of lead you by the hand into the world.
Right.
And then because I've made you believe that these are real people who cook their food and wash their clothes and argue and figure out where to sleep and how, then you will also believe
Right.
the goddesses intervening.
Right. And so for you, this is what, so to speak, populates the imagination in terms of giving a different perspective on something that could be as simple as washing clothes or so.
Basically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
The realism of the world building is something that anchors the reader in the book and makes them believe in the world of the book. But you don't necessarily have to relate that to the things that you're going to be talking about. So, for example, if you are putting queer characters in a book, there's no need to put homophobia and transphobia in the book in order to say this is the real world. The mere fact that you've got them there and that people accept that it's a real world and that those things don't exist already gives you a sense of estrangement.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Right. I think also speaking to world building and the like, we had a few questions which I think also came from Ashmi actually, but in terms of, are there any tropes in speculative fiction, in either fantasy or science fiction, that you like to work with, and or like a general idea that helps you do world building, or that you want to center a story on, have centered a story on before? I mean, there's so many different ones, like, I don't know, mad scientist tropes, interdimensional travel, whatever it really is. There's a few things that always come up in these genres.
I thought about things like that in those terms much more when I started out writing. I think I try and not think in terms of tropes anymore. But in the beginning, I needed to figure out the genre and needed to figure out my place in the genre. And what happened partially was that I was very afraid of tropes, and I was afraid of redoing the same things that everyone else had already been doing. Which meant that I started steering clear of many of the things I love about fantasy. I've always thought that I'd love to write about dragons, but how to do dragons in a way that no one's done dragons before. You know, you get, as a writer, you kind of tend to then get hung up on these things. So I don't really, I try not think in those terms anymore, because for me, it just hinders and hampers my creativity. I think at the beginning that I did it was in a sense beneficial, because what happened was I have now created a fantasy world that's kind of low-key fantasy. It's not, we only have the human race, there are no other races except humans. The magic is not extremely prevalent and not even all that important to the plot. It is, but someone smarter than me once called my novels psychological fantasy, which is a term I really like. So by trying to avoid a lot of tropes, I think I managed to sort of create my own niche. But now I don't really think in those terms. I'm sure you could find a lot of tropes if you started digging in my books, but I prefer not to analyze them quite that way myself.
Cheryl?
I write all sorts of stuff. I mean, I've written steampunk, I've written Arthurian fantasy, I've written sort of space opera, you know, and my work is almost certainly full of tropes, because I'm not a very good writer, and I have to have those crutches and things. You know, maybe if I had time to work on the writing, then I would get good like Maria, and I would be able to sort of get myself away from that sort of thing. But as it is, it's more of a hobby than anything else. So I just go with it.
Also, perhaps similar to that, is there any inspiration in like authors that you absolutely admire and you maybe have tried to emulate or at least take inspiration from in other ways? Perhaps also more at the beginning of your writing rather than now, but you know, some things stick with us, I guess.
For me, I'm not very original. I'm afraid it's always going to be Ursula Le Guin. And I love that she's written so much that I keep discovering new stuff that I haven't read yet. And I also am so glad that I treated myself to this huge collection of her short stories, because it includes her really, really early short stories and then progresses. And I was so happy to see she wasn't perfect from the start. I mean, you can hear her tone and you can see that she's there, but she's not, you know, she hasn't arrived fully yet. And that was such a relief. You don't have to be perfect from the start.
Yeah, I mean, an awful lot of the stuff that one of the things about learning to write is that a lot of people start off writing essentially fanfic. And that's because it's so much easier to craft a story in a world that you're familiar with. And I think, although a lot of what I've done is not strictly fanfic in the way that it's normally thought of, it's definitely based on other people's worlds. I mentioned Arthurian fantasy. I've done Lovecraftian horror. You know, I've done Homer fanfic. Everybody does Homer fanfic because he's great. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of people that I've taken ideas from. I wouldn't say that I necessarily tried to write like them. I certainly wouldn't say that I admired Lovecraft. He's an awful person. But nevertheless, he has managed to create a really interesting toolbox in which to play. And I'm delighted, by the way, that Maria mentioned Le Guin, because if she hadn't, I would have had to do so. And everybody out there who's a Le Guin fan should go and read her books, because they will love them too.
Thank you.
Let me see. Also a bit of a more silly question, I guess. If you could turn one of your books into a movie, or a TV show even, what would that look like? Would you even want to? And if yes, what would that look like? And who would you cast? And, you know, is there anything you've envisioned? I mean, so much stuff gets turned into television and film now that it's not completely out of the question, I guess.
My novel Maresi has, I've sold the movie option to Film 4 in the UK, and it's stuff is happening with it. I don't know, you know, yet if it will be a movie, but it's you know, it's moving forward anyway. And I think that means I'm not thinking about that at all. You know, I have no vision because I have no say. You know, I gave away all. I mean, they have all the rights and all that. I have nothing to do with the project. So I'm trying not to think about it too much. But I also, I'm okay with that, because I really feel like I've done my work of art, and now hopefully they will make another. So I don't feel like it has to be, I don't want to have full control, because for me, what's the point of telling the same story in the exact same way twice?
Yeah, I think that's really, just to pick up on that, because I taught a class on literary adaptation, but not just from book to film, but to different media. And there's still so much discussion where basically the film is quite often judged just based on how faithful it is to the book. So I think it's interesting to hear an author say, well, you know, actually, I'm very aware it's a completely different medium, and why tell the same story twice rather than, there's other authors that have been very, very protective of their stuff, and were really involved, like George R. R. Martin in Game of Thrones, and then obviously that went also completely different ways. But
well, the thing is also, I'm not George R. R. Martin. I don't have that kind of clout, so there was never that option. So I think I have to take the sane and healthy route, and just say, fine, you do you, and I do me.
George had worked in Hollywood for many years before he retired from TV to write the Song of Ice and Fire. So he was already immersed in that world. He knew how to do it. And therefore, when the TV deal came along for those books, it was relatively easy for him to get involved and to have a say. If you are an author who's never had anything to do with the world of television, then, or of Hollywood, it's much more difficult to get in and be part of that. I mean, there are people who have been protective. I mean, I think possibly one of the best examples is with Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. They had endless offers to make a film of Good Omens, and they turned them all down. And the reason they did so is fairly obvious if you heard them talk about it, is that every time they went into a meeting with Hollywood people, the Hollywood people simply would not get the book. The book is a very British comedy, and the Hollywood people always wanted to change it to be a very American book, and possibly a very American action movie rather than a comedy. So they kept turning it down for those reasons. There are other books where it is much easier to see exactly what it is. But I mean, my view is that it's pointless trying to convert a novel into a movie, because you don't have enough space for the narrative. That movies are much better based on short fiction. And if you've got a novel, you really need to have an entire season of TV to work with it.
Yeah, true. We got another question. I'm not fully sure I get what it's going at, but I'm going to read it out. Mayim says, I know you said that science fiction is not a trope for you, or it's not tropey, I guess, but what would you say about the use of the genre for political messages? And the comment is, in which the genre becomes a trope for the author to criticize authority.
Can I quote Le Guin? I don't speak message, I speak story. If I was into political messages, I would be working in a completely different medium than literature. I am interested in literature and not in that sense activism, or I might be, but in my spare time. I think if I, as a writer, if I would go into writing my stories with the intent of a political message, I would write very bad fiction, and it would be unbearable to read. That said, who I am, what I value, what I find important or upsetting or scary, or these things, of course, show in what I write. I can't separate myself from the text in that way, but no, I don't go in with a message.
On the other hand, having read 3 of your books, I would say that they all have incredibly powerful political messages to them, simply because of who you are and the sort of things that you write about. So you don't have to, I mean, I think anybody who goes in with the objective of writing a political message book is liable to write pretty bad fiction. But every writer has things that they care about, and that comes through in what they do.
Yes, of course.
And that's equally true for fantasy as science fiction. I mean, fantasy can be just as political as science fiction if you write it in the correct way.
So I already covered a lot of ground from kind of the question we had before. There's more coming in, so that's good. Yeah, there's a comment just to say, I think even though the author speaks messages, yet there are plenty of interpretations about these, and one of them can be politically interpreted. So I guess, yeah, there's a lot of I guess it goes at like, I mean, what the author wants to write, or it has in mind when writing, is probably sometimes different than what the audience makes it of. But
of course, but that's the beauty of literature for me as well. I mean, very often when people talk about my books, I think, oh my gosh, who is that intelligent person who's written that stuff? I had no idea that was in the text.
Have you ever read any, is there any academic work being done on your literature? Do you know, like, have you?
But I do not read it.
Okay, good.
No way.
That's the other version of, like, I mean, so many people get asked, do you, like, if they're actors in television shows, they often get the question, do you read fan fiction about your characters? I think it's even more interesting to read academic work about the thing you star in or write. I think it must be equally scary. I don't know. I'm the academic sitting on the other side, but it must be very interesting if you're the person that's being interpreted by academics.
I'm curious, but I think it would be very harmful to me as a creative person.
Do you know if there's fan fiction about your work?
I've seen fan art, but
Okay.
I don't know if there's any fan fiction.
There might be. There's a lot of fan fiction about everything. I don't know. Yeah. Do we have more questions from our audience? Because I mean, I haven't asked every single question that we came up with in the up front, but I think we covered a lot of the ground that we kind of thought about. So if there's more, I know we don't have a massive audience right now, but if there are more questions that you thought about before, or just because through the conversation, just put them in the chat window, and we can also call on you to actually ask it in person if you want to. Just maybe give a few seconds. If there's nothing coming in, obviously, if there's anything, do you guys have anything you want to plug? I mean, this is a good moment to promote any of your projects or any work you're doing right now, whether that's, in Cheryl's case, also academic or more activist, or just fiction, or whatever's happening. I mean, we just learned Maria apparently sold film rights, so that might be a thing. So if there's anything you want us to know, that's a moment. But we also have a new question.
Great question.
In hindsight, if there was something you could change about anything you have written, what would you change?
Well, you know, I don't think I would change anything, which doesn't mean it's perfect by any means. But if I start thinking about what I want to change, I'll never write anything new. You just have to let go. I read my debut novel out loud for my son a few years ago. And, you know, it was a bit cringy, and there were definitely things I would change. But at the same time, I did the best I could at the time. And there's a certain enthusiasm and wide-eyed wonder at this thing. Hey, I'm writing, look at me, I'm just throwing everything in here and then extra that. Yay, this is fun. That I don't think I could recreate today. So there are things that, I mean, definitely could be improved on in all my work. But instead of trying to think of that, I'm trying to do better with the next one.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl?
Well, if I had a magic hat and I could drop my stories into it and they would come out the other side sounding like they've been written by Cat Valenti, then obviously yes. But no, I mean, you know, there are some of the early reviews that I wrote when I first started out were not very good. But they're now a matter of historical record. They're there on the internet. There's nothing much I can do about that. So yeah, I'm stuck with it. Let's write new stuff.
Yeah, I just reread an academic article I wrote over 4 years ago, and I was cringing a lot. And I'm very glad it wasn't a big publication.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe we have another question, but maybe in connection to that, I'm wondering, because if you're like, especially Maria, if you put out work, I mean, every time any of us put out any work into the world, we open ourselves up to criticism. And Maria, now knowing that, I mean, your work is getting read in many different places in the world, and then also in translation that might change things. Do you ever sit there going, oh my God, the reviews, what is going to happen? Was it ever scary for you to kind of put that out there and then obviously get feedback?
It's terrifying, but earlier on, I think for me it's most terrifying the first time I let someone else read a text. And then I work on it, and I get more and more sort of used to rewriting it and getting comments. And then when I have the review date and I sit and wait for the reviews, yes, it's nerve-wracking. But I'm mostly scared that no one will review it, more so than what they'll say. And I'm maybe more afraid that they won't see what I tried to do, that I will have failed in that respect. But almost always what saved me, I think, is that when a book has come out, I have already gone deep into the process of the next one because of how the publishing industry works. So when the book actually is published, I'm like, yeah, well, that's nice, but I'm here, and this is my new love, and that's my ex. And I don't really care, I'm emotionally invested somewhere else, maybe. Except with the last book, I actually had not begun a new project because I was writing a commissioned play. And I think I was more thin-skinned because of that, because I didn't have that barrier of being deep into something new.
Cool. We have a question, which is, do you guide the story while writing, or is it the other way around? Does the story guide you?
It's one of those things that for me, it's really hard to say which is which. Man, writing's hard, and it's hard to talk about writing and putting it into words because it so easily starts to sound like mumbo jumbo or like magical thinking. And it is a little bit for me. I definitely guide the story, but I also try and be open and let it guide me. My ideal is that I somehow manage to build a framework for the story, a world and characters, and I might have an idea of where I want it to go. But if I've done the framework, and if I've done the characters, and I've built the world, and I've really made it come alive, then the best thing I can do is step back and let the story show me where it wants to go. And in every instance so far with my novels, I've had an idea that this is the story I want to write. And I write the first draft, and I take a step back, and I start reading it, and I go, oh, but it's actually about this, something completely different than what I thought. If I've done my job well, I tapped into something in me that I didn't maybe know was there, or something I didn't know I wanted to say. And then my job is to edit and lift and hone and show that theme that sort of appeared in the story without my conscious intention.
Cheryl?
I've never written anything longer than a short story, and it's relatively hard for the characters to take the story away from you at that length. And I think also I write mainly in my head, that I don't actually write the story down until I know what it is. So I will spend a lot of time thinking about the story when I'm in the shower, when I'm walking into town, and so on and so forth. And that will go through a process. And then once I'm then happy with it, then I can just sit down in front of the computer and splurge 5,000 words, whatever. So it's a little harder for me to know whether exactly how that's working.
We have another question, and I think we touched upon the first part. Do you have a role model in which you were inspired to write? So we already talked Le Guin and Maria's case, but why do you both write?
And it saw somebody the other day when they were asked why do they write, they just said, how can I not? You know, if you are a writer, you write stuff. That's what I've always done.
It's my way of being in the world. It's my way of figuring things out. I don't know what I think about things before I write it down. And when I write, I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's just a feeling that I am in the right place, and that this is what I'm good at. And by that, I don't mean that I'm, a fantastic writer, but it's here, this is where my skills lay. And this is the only place I've ever been ambitious. I've had other jobs and they've been fine, but I never really cared about them. But when I write, I always want to do better. I want to be better. I want to grow. I want to learn. It's the only place where I really find that I am an ambitious person.
So a longer question. I know that you both suggested that fantasy gives you the space to represent diversity in a way that realistic fiction doesn't, but young adult fiction has earned a reputation for being proactively diverse. Is there something inherent in the genre other than those market forces? So like the intended audience, the type of authors who are drawn to it, or something else that encourages and breeds that sort of vibrancy in the way that puts it ahead of many other genres in that respect? So is it something inherent to also the young adult stuff, or fantasy, that makes it inherently more vibrant, more diverse, I guess?
Yes and yes. If I try and answer both, I think when it comes to fantasy, and I think that kind of goes across the board in many countries, is that fantasy, we're still in the margin, right? Speculative fiction, we don't get to play in the fancy rooms with the fancy real authors, and that gives a certain freedom. We're kind of weirdos in the margins anyway, so why not do what we want to do? And for me, that definitely gives a certain freedom. And when it comes to YA, I just feel like young people and young readers today are so smart, and generally speaking, so like much smarter and more educated about issues than I am often. I have to work to keep up with them.
Cheryl?
Yeah, I think YA fiction markets itself as being good at diversity. I'm not necessarily sure that it is. There's a certain subset of YA writers, the people who created the Own Voices movement, who do really, really good stuff. But the publishing industry wants to be seen to be being diverse, but it has no idea how to do it. And the vast majority of YA fiction that has been written about trans people by cisgender people has been awful. It's only where you get into writing the science fiction and fantasy, and particularly where trans people have been allowed to come in and do stuff themselves. So those two things, that it starts to, you get a much better representation. I did a whole academic paper on this for a conference in Bologna a few years back, and that's published now. So if you look at the academic writing section of my website, you can find a link to that. We are getting better, I think, with YA stuff about trans people. Partly, as I say, because we've got actual trans people writing it, people like Juno Dawson and Fox Benwell and so on. But equally, when you're writing that for a realist market, the pressure from the publishers to replicate stereotypical tropes is very strong, and it's very hard for realist authors who don't have a personal connection to get away from that.
Mm. So perhaps also I was wondering just now when you said that, if you write explicitly trans stuff for a young adult market, is there still a concern that, think of the children, we cannot expose the children to this, even though it might be vital to them because A, they might be trans themselves, or B, they should just learn trans people exist and that's a thing and it's fine, and they don't have to buy into all the conservative nonsense that's out there. But at the same time, I mean, whenever you even want to do sex education in schools, and it's not even just that, if you just want to tell people queer people exist, it's suddenly like, oh, the children, we can't expose them. And does that happen with young adult fiction? Or
Cheryl, I think maybe you know more than I do.
Well, I'm not a novelist, so I don't get to the sharp end. But I know, for example, when I was working with Mike Carey on the Book of Coley series, that one of the things I was constantly telling him is, Mike, you could potentially get into trouble here. That the anti-trans movement is very strong in Britain, and there are things here that they may pick up on. But he was quite happy to go ahead with it, and his editors were quite happy to let him go ahead with it. So yeah, fine. And I think Juno Dawson in particular gets away with writing really, really queer books, which is fabulous. But I'm sure it hasn't always been like that, and it may not always be like that. We are in the UK looking to go backwards on LGBT rights very, very rapidly indeed. So the whole situation could to change overnight.
Let's hope that's not the case. I mean, the US is kind of a weird mixed bag of one day rolling back stuff, and then the next day the Supreme Court suddenly is saying, oh, well, actually. But yeah, it's a very, very kind of, not interesting, I would say, time, more scary time, but it's certainly a very insecure time if you're queer, and especially if you're a trans person. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay. Something pops up. Because generally I'd say we don't have to fill complete 90 minutes. We're about over an hour now. Everybody's used to just looking at their screen anyway for hours on end these days. I mean, perhaps
I had a thought that came up when it's not really the same thing that the question was pertaining, but one thing that's been interesting for me is that very different things get reacted to in different countries. What I write. And I think coming from a Nordic country, you can be a little oblivious to what's going on out there in the world. And one of the things, for instance, that I got comments on when I visited the UK the first time with my book Maresi, was that I got many positive comments on the fact that in a YA novel with a girl main character, that she eats. And it's a positive thing. And it's not because she has any eating disorder or anything. She likes food and she likes to eat. And it's like a normal, natural thing. And I got many positive comments on that. Like, that's so refreshing. And I'm like, okay. I didn't know that was like something special, because no one in Finland or Sweden had ever commented on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Cheryl, have you noticed something like that, especially?
I was just wondering, actually, Maria, I mean, Maresi is a very violent novel. There's an awful lot of dead people by the end. Did anyone pick you up on that?
I mean, Maresi and the following book, Naundel, is even worse. It's pretty awful. I do get like, the children. I do get that with the sort of dark themes and the violence, but of course never from the actual children. Or I mean, young readers. I've never ever gotten a comment from a young reader that the books are too violent or too dark or anything like that. It's only from the adults ever. And yes, they are violent and there's sexual violence. And Naundel for me is the one book where I don't really think it is a YA, but since I am an author with very poor planning and I just follow my heart and I just write when I need to write, I wrote a trilogy where the middle book is not a YA, but the other two are. And I do understand that it's difficult to sort of, break that in the middle of a trilogy. But for me, it's not a YA, not because of the violence or anything, but just because it's mainly old women who look back on their lives. Mm-hmm. And that no longer fills any criteria for YA. But I mostly am not very graphic with anything. And I think that's why adult readers see my books as much more violent, because they understand what's happening. And the younger the reader, the more they sort of glaze over that, because they're not really clear on what's happening, luckily.
We have another question. Cheryl, from one Jerry Anderson fan to another, which is your favorite Anderson show and why?
Alrighty, so I never saw Four Feather Falls, and I think I only saw a few episodes of Supercar, so there's nothing much to talk about. I loved Fireball XL5 because one of the main characters was Dr. Venus. She was an equal member of the crew. She was the scientist. Steve Zodiac was just the guy who went out there to hit things. Venus was the one with the brains. So that was cool. But I think my favorite was probably Stingray. And partially because it's the one I remember best. And partially because I got kind of emotionally invested in it on behalf of poor Atlanta, because I mean she has a proper job, a responsibility and everything, and does that very well, and bloody Troy Tempest keeps chasing off after the blonde mermaid, who mostly spends her time getting into trouble and needing to be rescued. So yeah, Stingray for me.
Thank you. I have to say that I had not heard of Jerry Anderson until very recently. It seems to be an Anglosphere thing. I'm not sure it ever was translated or if it was translated before my time. So there's probably more people in this chat going, what are they talking about? Yeah, so I'd say if there are no more questions coming in at this moment, if there's anything you both want to say to wrap up, again, perhaps shameless plugs for your work or anything you have come up with that you feel like we haven't touched upon, now would be the time to do that.
Back in a minute.
I can plug my trilogy, which is out in its entirety in English now, like you said, with Pushkin Press, Maresi, Naundel, and Maresi Red Mantle. And unfortunately, in German, only the first book is out. Maresi. Das Lied der Insel, I think, is the...
Do you know when the sequels are coming out in German?
I don't think they are.
Not at all. So German readers will never learn how this continues. This is sad.
You must write and complain to Heine.
Yeah, definitely we will. I think Cheryl is getting something too. Okay.
Yeah, as I'm a publisher, I might as well plug the books. Best-selling book by far is this one, The Green Man's Heir by Juliet McKenna. That's now sold over 12,000 copies, which is absolutely amazing for a small press. And the sequel, The Green Man's Foe, was launched at Worldcon last year. That's also sold well, but I mean, obviously nowhere near those quantities, but a few thousand, which is great. And book 3, The Green Man's Silence, will be coming out probably in September. But you know, I'm relatively relaxed about schedules. I want to make sure that the artist and the editor and author have plenty of time to sort stuff out. So, I mean, those books have been hugely successful. This one was a finalist for Best Novel in the British Fantasy Awards last year. This one was a finalist for Best Novel in the British Science Fiction Association Awards this year. And fingers crossed it will be in the British Fantasy Awards as well. So I'm very, very proud of Juliet and what she's achieved with those books. Maria, you've got pick.
I just have to show my Tiptree Award honor list. Certificate from the Secret Feminist Cabal.
Very good. All right. So yeah, I'd like to thank both of you again for joining us today. We're still sad that we don't all get to meet in September. But I think at least this was a good replacement to actually talk to you. And I hope that one day we will actually be able to do conferences again. And then maybe there's another chance to invite you to Germany or wherever one of us will be, because, you know, the academic market might take us elsewhere. But
yeah. I should mention, by the way, that virtual FinCon will be happening in July, I presume on the 11th, 12th, which is when the original convention was supposed to be. I don't know if you're involved in it, Maria, but I know that I have recorded an interview with Mike Carey about the Book of Coley and how we work together on it. And that's directly relevant to the stuff that we've been talking about today. I suspect that it will be free to watch. So once I get information from FinCon as to how to do that, I shall stick it up on my blog and social media.
yes, again, oh, so yeah, if you want to tell people where they can find you online, we had circulated everybody's website, but no social media. So if you want to plug your Twitter account or anything, again, do this now and we'll wrap up.
I'm mostly on Instagram these days. I'm not great on Twitter. I'm way too wordy to fit anything on Twitter. And I've had a blog in Swedish, but that was a long time ago. So I'm mostly on Instagram. And my handle is @Turtschaninoff, so at my awful last name. Good luck spelling it.
I'm at Cheryl Morgan on Twitter.
Perfect. And yeah, I can recommend following Cheryl on Twitter. She's always entertaining and has great stuff. And I'll definitely follow Maria on Instagram now. So, all right. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And yeah, have a good day everywhere. And don't melt in the UK or Germany.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.